I remember the day my wife asked me for space. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears, just a quiet evening in our living room, the TV murmuring in the background, and her hands nervously twisting her wedding ring. After 40 years of marriage, you start noticing the little things, the tone of a sigh, the pause before a sentence. So when she said, "I just need some space, Tom," I already knew what was coming. I didn't interrupt. I just nodded and watched her eyes drift toward the window, as if the world outside held more comfort than I did. 40 years is a long time. We had built everything together: a home, 2 grown kids, a garden she loved more than anything, and memories layered across decades like old wallpaper. But lately, our house had grown quiet. Too quiet. We didn't fight. We didn't laugh much either. Just 2 people sharing walls and routines. When she said she needed space, I didn't argue. I didn't ask why or who, or what had changed. I simply said, "All right." That word, simple, calm but heavy, hung in the air for a long while. She seemed almost surprised I didn't fight it. Maybe she wanted a reaction. Maybe she wanted to feel wanted. But I was too tired for emotional tug-of-war. You reach a certain age where peace becomes more valuable than pride. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, a cup of black coffee going cold beside me. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. My wedding ring felt heavier than usual. I turned it around my finger a few times, wondering when love had turned into habit, and habit into distance. People think betrayal always looks like shouting or lies. But sometimes it's just quiet detachment, the slow fading of us into you and me. And as I sat there, I realized this wasn't about space. It was about freedom, hers, and maybe mine too. The next morning, she packed a small suitcase. No drama, no note. Just said she'd be staying at her sister's for a while. She promised it wasn't forever, just some time apart. I smiled and helped her carry the bag to her car. Her hands trembled a little when she took the keys. I could have asked her to stay. I could have begged, promised, argued. But instead I said, "Drive safe." When the car disappeared down the street, I stood on the porch longer than I needed to. The air smelled of rain and cut grass. A lifetime's worth of memories flickered in my mind like an old film reel. Her laughter at our wedding, the night we brought our first child home, the way she'd hum when she cooked on Sunday mornings. And now, all that was left was silence. That week, I didn't tell anyone. Not the kids, not my friends. It wasn't shame, it was respect. She needed her space, and for the first time in my life, I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. But deep down, something shifted in me that day. Not bitterness, just clarity. When someone you've loved your whole life decides to walk away, you stop seeing yourself as their anchor. You start realizing that you too can drift, just in a different direction. In the quiet of that empty house, I found myself thinking about all the years I'd given, the birthdays I remembered, the anniversaries I planned, the sacrifices made without a second thought. And now, I wondered if she ever truly saw them. That's when I made a silent promise to myself. If she needed space, I'd give it, all of it. No calls, no visits, no questions. I wouldn't chase what wanted to leave. And if life had its way of balancing things, of returning what's lost, then I'd wait to see how that balance unfolded. Because I've learned something over time, sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the beginning of quiet strength. And that's how it began, not with anger, but with acceptance. When my wife asked for space, I didn't just step back. I let go. Before everything started falling apart, we had what most people would call a good marriage. Not perfect, but real. I met Susan when I was 23, fresh out of college and full of ideas about what a happy life looked like. She worked at a local bookstore, always had her nose in a novel, and had the kind of laugh that could make an ordinary day feel special. I wasn't exactly charming back then, too shy, too practical, but she said she liked that about me. Said I was the kind of man who looked like he'd stay when things got hard. We dated for a year before I asked her to marry me. There was no big gesture, No fireworks or candlelight dinner. Just the two of us sitting in my old pickup truck outside her apartment, rain tapping on the windshield, and me saying, "I can't picture a life that doesn't include you." She smiled, took my hand, and said yes. Our early years were a blur of small apartments, second-hand furniture, and endless dreams. Money was tight, but we were happy. We built everything piece by piece, working overtime, saving where we could, celebrating even the smallest victories. When we bought our first home, it wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, and a leaky faucet that refused to stay fixed. But it was ours. I still remember painting the living room walls that first summer, her in an old sweatshirt, streaks of paint in her hair, music playing from the radio. We were young, broke, and content. As the years went on, life got busier. I started a small construction business, and she decided to stay home after our second child was born. She said it was temporary, just until they started school, but she loved being a mother so much that temporary turned into 20 years. Our kids, Emily and Ryan, became the center of our world. Every decision revolved around them, their schools, their health, their happiness. I worked long hours to keep everything running, and Susan took care of everything else. She ran the house with precision, love, and quiet strength. It was a good life, stable, predictable, safe. But looking back, I can see the cracks that slowly began to form. You see, routine can be comforting, but it can also dull the edges of connection. Somewhere between morning coffee and late-night bills, between baseball games and PTA meetings, we forgot to look at each other the way we used to. She became mom. I became provider. And love became logistics. At the time, it didn't feel like anything was wrong. We still talked, laughed occasionally, planned vacations. But the spark that once burned between us turned into a steady dim glow, enough to see by, but not enough to feel the warmth. The kids grew up faster than we expected. One day, they were little faces at the breakfast table. The next, they were packing for college. The day Ryan left for the university, Susan cried quietly in the car on the drive home. I tried to comfort her, said things like, "He'll call every week, and we did our job right." But something about the silence that followed felt heavy, as if parenting had been the glue holding us together, and now that it was gone, we didn't know what to do with all the space between us. That's when she started picking up new hobbies: yoga, gardening, volunteering at the library. I admired her for it. I thought she was just trying to rediscover herself. But in truth, she was slowly learning how to live without me. Meanwhile, I was busy building my retirement plan, making sure the business ran smoothly. Work gave me purpose, and an excuse. An excuse to avoid facing the fact that my marriage, though still standing, had become quiet, hollow. We weren't fighting, we were fading. One night, about 10 years ago, we sat across from each other at dinner, the sound of cutlery filling the silence. I looked at her and realized I couldn't remember the last time we had a real conversation that wasn't about groceries, bills, or our kids. So I asked, "Are you happy?" She looked startled, like I had just spoken a language she hadn't heard in years. Then she smiled softly and said, "Of course." But her eyes told a different story. After that, life went on as usual. We celebrated our 25th anniversary with a dinner our kids planned. Family photos, laughter, cake, the works. From the outside, we looked like a couple who had it all figured out. But inside, we were just two people who loved the memories more than the present. When retirement came, I thought things would get better. More time together, more trips, more peace. But retirement can be a mirror. It shows you everything you've ignored. And what I saw wasn't comforting. She had grown independent, and not in a bad way. Just detached. She had her own routines, her own friends, her own quiet joys. I had my workshop, my books, my coffee alone every morning at the same kitchen table. We lived under the same roof, but we were already living separate lives. Still, I didn't think much of it. I thought marriage was about endurance, about staying, no matter what. But one day, out of nowhere, she started talking about space. About finding herself again. I nodded, pretending to understand. Maybe I did understand. Maybe I just didn't want to admit it. When you spend 40 years with someone, you assume you'll grow old together. You picture the two of you sitting on the porch, watching sunsets, talking about grandkids. But sometimes, life doesn't stick to the script. Sometimes, love changes form, softens, fades, or simply outgrows its old shape. The truth is, I wasn't angry at her. I was scared. Scared that I had given my best years to something that no longer existed. Scared that all the sacrifices, all the loyalty, all the quiet moments, meant nothing now. But even as that fear settled in, something inside me stayed calm. Because deep down, I believed that life has its own sense of balance. That one day, every unanswered question finds its voice. Every wound finds its closure. So when Susan said she needed space, I didn't stop her. I wanted to see what she would do with that freedom, and what I would do with mine. And that's where this story truly begins. Not in the falling apart, but in what happened after. Because when someone walks away thinking they've found themselves, sometimes they discover something else entirely. What they left behind. When Susan first said she needed space, I thought she meant something small, a weekend away, maybe a short visit to her sister's place in Chicago. But what she really meant was distance. Emotional. Physical. Spiritual. All of it. It started subtly. She began spending more time out of the house. Yoga retreats, volunteer work, girls' weekends. I didn't question it much at first. I told myself, she's earned this. After 40 years of raising kids, cooking meals, managing everything, she deserved time for herself. But soon, the weekends turned into weeks. Then came the trial separation. That's what she called it. Trial. As if 40 years of marriage was something that could be paused, tested, and resumed at will. She told me she wanted to find herself again. I asked gently, "Did you lose yourself here with me?" She didn't answer. Just looked down at her coffee, hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing keeping her steady. That silence said everything. She packed light, a few clothes, her laptop, her journal, and moved into a small apartment near downtown. I helped her carry the boxes. I didn't argue. Didn't ask her to stay. Because when someone's heart starts walking away from you, holding on tighter only makes them run faster. For the first time in decades, I came home to an empty house. Her shoes weren't by the door. The smell of her perfume wasn't floating in the hallway. The kitchen counter, once cluttered with grocery lists and sticky notes, looked sterile. I thought I'd feel angry. But what I felt was something deeper, hollow quiet. The kind that hums inside your chest and makes every clock tick sound louder. At first, I tried to fill that silence. I fixed the fence, rearranged the garage, joined a local book club. I even started cooking for myself, terribly at first. Burned the eggs twice, then learned to laugh about it. But no matter how busy I kept myself, every night ended the same. Me sitting alone on the couch, staring at the empty spot where she used to read her novels. Then one evening, while I was watering the plants in the backyard, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Susan. Just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. It was simple. Polite. Cold. The kind of message you send to a neighbor, not a husband. I typed back, "I'm doing fine. You?" She replied a few minutes later. "Better than I've felt in years. I just needed some air, you know?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Better than I've felt in years. That sentence stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because it was honest. For the next few months, we barely spoke. She'd call occasionally to ask about bills, insurance, small things that made our conversations feel transactional. Our kids noticed, of course. Emily would ask, "Dad, are you and Mom okay?" I always said, "We're just giving each other some space." It was easier than telling her the truth, that I didn't really know. One day, while I was at the grocery store, I ran into an old family friend, Margaret. She looked at me with that careful sympathy people give when they've heard things. "I saw Susan downtown the other day," she said softly.
She looked happy. Younger, even. Good for her.
I smiled politely, said, "Yeah, she's doing well." But that night, I sat in my chair by the window, staring out at the dark, and asked myself something I hadn't dared to before. What if she's happier without me? That question burned quietly in the back of my mind. It didn't feel like anger, it felt like erasure. Like I'd been part of a book she decided to stop reading.
Months passed. Fall turned into winter.
The holidays came, and for the first time, we spent Christmas apart. I sent her a simple card, "Merry Christmas, Susan. Hope you're well." She replied with a photo of her tree.
Not our tree. Hers.
Smaller, simpler, but glowing with warmth. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat by the fire. I thought about all the Christmases before, the laughter, the decorations, the kids running through the house, and I realized something brutal yet freeing. I had loved her for who she was, but she had changed.
And maybe, so had I.
Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her sudden independence didn't feel natural, it felt scripted. Like someone had been whispering in her ear. Then, one afternoon in early spring, I drove into town to pick up some paint. While waiting at a red light, I saw her.
Susan.
Walking down Main Street, laughing, with a man I didn't recognize. He looked maybe 10 years younger than me. Neatly dressed, confident, hand resting on her shoulder like they'd known each other for years.
She looked radiant. Lighter.
It was like watching a stranger wearing my wife's face.
I didn't follow them. Didn't confront her.
Instead, I drove home, parked the car, and sat there for an hour. No tears, no yelling. Just quiet disbelief.
That night, she called.
"Hey," she said casually, "just wanted to check in." I stayed silent for a moment, then said, "You seem happy."
She hesitated. "What do you mean?"
"I saw you today," I said evenly.
"With him."
The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the phone line.
Then she sighed.
"His name is Mark.
We met at the community center. He's just a friend." Just a friend.
Those words, I've learned, always come before the truth you already know. I didn't argue. Instead, I said, "I hope he makes you laugh the way you used to laugh with me."
Then I hung up.
That night was long. I walked through the house, touching the furniture, the photos, the walls we'd painted together decades ago. Every inch of it held echoes of a woman who was no longer mine, maybe never truly was. For a few days, I went quiet. Didn't answer her texts. Didn't call back. Then something changed inside me.
A strange calm replaced the hurt.
Because I realized, this wasn't about losing her. It was about rediscovering myself. She had taken space. I would give her what she asked for, and more.
Freedom.
The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I went to the bank, moved half our joint savings into her account, and closed it. Then I called our lawyer and started transferring the house title to my name only. She had said she wanted to live independently, so I made sure she could, entirely.
No malice.
No anger. Just boundaries. A week later, she called again, sounding uneasy. "Tom, did you move the savings?" I tried to check our account. I interrupted gently. "Yes. Your half is in your name now. No strings attached. You wanted space, I gave you freedom." She was silent. Then, quietly, she said, "I didn't mean to lose everything." I replied, "You didn't lose anything. You just found out what you really wanted." From that day on, something shifted between us. She stopped calling as often. And for the first time, I stopped waiting. It's strange, how peace comes not from fixing others, but from freeing yourself from their chaos. The neighbors noticed I looked different.
Happier.
I started jogging in the mornings, fixing up old furniture, reconnecting with my kids. Emily began visiting more often, and I told her gently, "Your mother and I are just on different paths."
She nodded sadly. You still love her, don't you? I smiled. Love doesn't end, honey.
It just changes its shape. But deep down, I knew something else was coming. Susan had made her choice, but choices have echoes. And soon, those echoes would find their way back to her door. Because life, as I've learned, has a quiet way of balancing itself. And sometimes, the calmest man carries the sharpest kind of justice. The turning point in my story came quietly, not through confrontation or dramatic words, but through an evening that changed the rhythm of my heart. It was a rainy Thursday. The house was still filled with familiar echoes, the sound of dripping water outside, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the smell of jasmine from the garden she once tended so carefully. I came home from my evening walk, umbrella dripping, and saw her sitting on the sofa, typing something on her phone. Her face looked peaceful, distant, almost like a stranger who had found comfort in a new version of herself. For months, I had accepted her space. I didn't question her absences, her late returns, or her soft, distracted tone. I cooked my own meals, cleaned my own clothes, and pretended I didn't notice the perfume that wasn't hers lingering on her scarf. But that night, something inside me shifted. She looked up briefly and said, "You're home early." I smiled gently. "It's raining." Thought I'd sit by the window for a while. There was silence. It wasn't awkward anymore, it was a silence that had grown roots between us. I made some tea and placed one cup in front of her, as I always did. She didn't look up. Just a faint thanks before she returned to her phone. I sat across from her, watching the steam rise from my cup. That's when I realized, love doesn't disappear in an instant. It fades in layers, until one day, you wake up and realize you've been loving a memory, not a person. That night, I couldn't sleep. My heart wasn't heavy with anger, it was heavy with understanding. The kind that hurts quietly. In the following days, I started noticing things differently. She wasn't cruel, just detached. She wasn't angry, just lost. I began to see her not as my wife of 40 years, but as a person searching for something I could no longer give. And then, one afternoon, the truth arrived, not as a confession, but as an accident. She had forgotten to log out of her email on the home computer. I never checked her messages before. I always believed in privacy and trust. But that day, curiosity wasn't born out of suspicion, it was born out of pain. I wanted to know what I had done wrong. One unread message caught my eye. The subject line read, "Thank you for last night." I stared at it for several minutes before opening it. The words were short, gentle, familiar, and filled with warmth. But they weren't meant for me. The man's name was Daniel. Someone she had met at her art workshop. They talked about poetry, traveling, and the freedom of rediscovering oneself. The messages weren't vulgar or shameful, they were emotional. They spoke of connection, laughter, and healing. I didn't feel rage. Instead, I felt a strange calmness, as if the storm inside me had finally broken into rain. After 40 years of shared mornings and sleepless nights, I realized she had drifted far from me, not because she stopped loving me, but because we both stopped growing together. That night, I sat on the porch, thinking about how love changes shape. When you're young, you fight for it. When you're old, you learn to release it. The next morning, I made her breakfast, just as I always did. Toast, omelette, and a cup of coffee. When she came to the table, her eyes looked tired. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. I nodded. "Just thinking." She hesitated before speaking again. "About us?" "Yes," I replied, "and about what comes next." Her eyes flickered with something, maybe guilt, maybe fear. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "I know," I said gently. "And I'm not here to make you feel small. But I think, maybe you were right. Maybe we both need space. Real space." For the first time in months, She looked directly into my eyes.
What do you mean? I mean freedom, I said.
Not just for you, for both of us.
She froze, unsure how to respond. I continued, my voice calm but steady.
You asked for space because you wanted to find yourself. I think I need that too. But I'll find it by letting go, not by holding on.
Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't speak.
She just looked down at her coffee cup, hands trembling slightly. That afternoon, I quietly started packing a few of my things. Not out of anger, out of peace. I moved to a small house near the lake, a place we had once visited in our early years of marriage. It was silent, beautiful, and honest, just like the part of me that had stayed patient all along.
Days turned into weeks. She called once, maybe twice.
We spoke politely, but the conversations were brief. I didn't ask where she was or who she was with. I didn't need to. Some truths are better carried in silence. Then, one morning, I received an envelope. Inside was a letter, her handwriting, neat but trembling.
You were right, she wrote.
I thought I needed space to find peace. But all I found was emptiness. The freedom I wanted feels cold without the warmth we once shared. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say, thank you for your silence. It showed me what love truly means. I read that letter 3 times before folding it away. I didn't cry.
I didn't smile.
I just closed my eyes and whispered, now I understand. From that day forward, my revenge, if you could even call it that, was not to make her feel regret. It was to live well, to stay kind, and to show that the calmest hearts often hold the greatest strength. I began painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I took walks by the lake every evening, watching the sky change colors. I met new people, quiet souls who had also known loss and peace.
Months later, she visited.
She looked older, softer. We sat on the porch together, the same way we had in our youth, but with different hearts. I thought you'd hate me, she said. I did for a day or two, I admitted, smiling faintly. Then I remembered, hate is heavy, and I've carried enough weight in my life. She looked away, tears filling her eyes again. I wish I had realized what I had before I lost it. Maybe you did, I said, just too late to keep it. Silence settled again. But this time, it wasn't bitter. It was peaceful, like two souls who had finally accepted the truth. That day, I understood something powerful. Sometimes, revenge isn't about hurting someone who wronged you. It's about becoming so whole, so content, that their betrayal loses its power. When I finally walked her to the door, she said softly, "You've changed."
I smiled. No.
I just stopped trying to fix what was meant to end. That was my turning point, not the discovery of her affair, not the moment I left, but the moment I chose peace over pain. In that quiet acceptance, I found a freedom greater than anything I had ever known. After that quiet afternoon on the porch, the one where she visited, apologized, and left again, life began to unfold in a gentler rhythm. I no longer woke up to the echo of her footsteps or the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. Instead, I woke up to the sound of the lake breeze tapping softly against the window and the rustle of leaves outside. It was strange at first. For 40 years, every habit, every small part of my morning, had been shared with her. Now it was just me, my cup of tea, the sunlight falling across the table, the sound of the clock ticking in perfect rhythm. But loneliness has two faces, one that aches and one that heals. Over time, mine became the latter. I began to rebuild myself, quietly, without any grand declarations. I started painting again, not for money or praise, but simply because it felt good to express things words couldn't carry. My first painting was of an empty bench by the lake, a place I often sat at sunset. When I finished it, I realized that bench symbolized something, not absence but peace. I sold a few of my paintings at a small local exhibition. People admired the calmness in my work, the way the colors seemed to breathe. One woman, a widow named Eliza, told me, "Your paintings feel like forgiveness." I smiled and said softly, maybe that's what they are. Through art, I found what years of argument and resentment never gave me: closure. Weeks turned into months, and gradually I saw my wife, or rather my ex-wife, from a distance. She had moved to a smaller apartment near the city, living quietly. Once, I saw her at the local grocery store. She looked thinner, slower, but when our eyes met, we both smiled. There was no anger left, just a soft understanding that we had walked a long path together, and it had finally ended where it needed to. That night, I thought deeply about forgiveness. Not the kind people talk about publicly, but the quiet kind, the one that happens in your chest, when you realize holding on serves no purpose anymore. You see, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering differently, without bitterness, without blame. I wrote her a letter that night. I don't hold anything against you, I wrote. What we had was real, and even if it ended with distance, it began with love. I wish you peace truly. I didn't mail it. I kept it in my drawer, as a symbol, a silent promise to myself that I had moved on. My revenge, if that word still applies, came quietly, naturally. It wasn't about her pain, it was about my peace. I lived with dignity, stayed kind, and carried no bitterness. People who knew me would often say, "You look lighter these days." They didn't know how true that was. There's something powerful about living well after being wronged. Not loudly, not to prove a point, but simply because you choose not to carry darkness anymore. A year later, I heard from a mutual friend that she wasn't doing too well. Her health had declined, and she lived mostly alone. I won't lie, the news stirred something in me. Not joy, not pity, just reflection. Life has a strange way of balancing things. One evening, I went to visit her. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the street below. When she saw me, her eyes widened with surprise, then softened. "You came," she whispered. "I did," I said, smiling gently. I was nearby. She tried to stand, but I gestured for her to stay seated. I sat across from her, and for a long time, we said nothing. The silence was familiar, the same kind we once shared after long days, the kind that spoke more than words. Finally, she broke it. "I never thought you'd forgive me." I didn't at first, I admitted. But holding on to anger only punished me, not you. I had to let it go, for my own peace. Tears filled her eyes. "You always were the better one between us." I smiled faintly. "No. I just learned my lesson a little earlier." We talked for an hour. About the past, about old friends, even about the garden we once kept. She told me she still thought of those quiet evenings, the ones where we'd sit on the porch, watching the world fade into dusk. When I stood to leave, she held my hand. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "You didn't have to." "I know," I said. "But sometimes we visit old places not to stay, just to see how far we've come." She smiled through her tears. "You've always known how to say things beautifully." I left her that night with a strange calmness in my heart. Not satisfaction, not regret, just acceptance. Life had come full circle. That was when I realized something profound. Revenge doesn't always need to hurt someone else. Sometimes, it's enough to prove to yourself that you've grown beyond the pain. As months passed, I continued my quiet life by the lake. My paintings started getting more attention. One local newspaper even wrote an article titled, "The Artist Who Paints Peace." I smiled when I saw it, not for pride, but because it felt like validation from life itself. A few years later, I heard she had passed away. I sat by the lake that evening, watching the reflection of the setting sun on the water. I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered a silent prayer for her soul, a prayer not of sorrow, but of gratitude. "Thank you," I murmured, "for teaching me what love, loss, and freedom truly mean." The next morning, I started a new painting, a sunrise over calm waters. I named it Freedom. Looking back now, I realized the greatest resolution wasn't her apology, or my forgiveness. it was understanding that life doesn't always give you closure in words. Sometimes, it gives it in silence, in peace, in the quiet acceptance that things happened exactly as they should have. People often ask me if I'd ever love again.
I tell them, love doesn't end.
It just changes its form.
Sometimes, love becomes distance. Sometimes, it becomes art.
And sometimes, it becomes wisdom. In the end, that's what my story became, not a tale of heartbreak but of healing. Not revenge through pain, but revenge through peace. And that, I believe, is the truest form of victory. It's been 10 years since she left. 10 long, quiet years filled with mornings of calm sunlight, evenings by the lake, and thoughts that no longer sting the way they used to. My house still looks the same. The old clock still ticks with that slow, patient rhythm. The walls still hold the faint scent of paint and old wood. The porch still faces the same sunset that has watched me grow older, softer, and wiser. But the man who sits here now isn't the same man who once begged for answers. Back then, I thought love was about holding on. I believed that if you just tried hard enough, stayed long enough, forgave enough, things would go back to how they used to be. But I learned that sometimes, love is about letting go, about allowing someone to choose their own path, even if that path walks away from you. In the early months after she left, I was angry.
I won't lie about that.
There were days when I replayed our arguments, trying to find where I went wrong. Days when I thought of her laughter echoing down the hallway, and it hurt more than I could admit. I wondered what freedom meant to her, and why my love wasn't part of it. But over time, that anger turned into reflection. And reflection, if you sit with it long enough, turns into peace. The truth is, she didn't take anything from me when she left. She only revealed what was already gone: connection, purpose, and shared dreams that had faded quietly over the years while we were too busy pretending everything was fine. Freedom, I realized, isn't just something you give someone else. It's something you earn for yourself when you stop living in the shadow of what used to be. Now, when I paint, I think of life as layers of color. Each experience, love, betrayal, silence, forgiveness, adds depth. And just like a canvas, you don't erase the old strokes, you paint over them, blending them into something new. That's what healing really is, not removing the pain, but transforming it into something meaningful. I still keep that letter I wrote her years ago in my drawer. I've never mailed it, never read it again, but I keep it because it reminds me of the day I finally chose peace over pride. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves softly through the trees, I think about her. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. She was the lesson I didn't know I needed. She taught me that love isn't ownership. It's not control. It's not even forever. It's presence, and when it's gone, what remains is what you do with the space it leaves behind. I filled that space with art, with reflection, with quiet moments of stillness that once felt unbearable. And in that silence, I found something more valuable than reconciliation. I found myself. Life has a way of teaching you the same lesson over and over until you finally understand it. Mine was simple: you can't force people to stay, but you can choose how gracefully you let them go. Sometimes, people walk away not because they stopped loving you, but because their path requires something you can't give. And that's okay. Everyone's journey is meant to be different, even those who once shared your home, your bed, your life. Now, when people ask me if I ever regret not fighting harder to bring her back, I tell them this: I didn't lose her. I let her find herself. And in doing so, I found myself too. There's a certain peace that comes with that understanding, a quiet, steady peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's presence or apology. That's the kind of peace I wish for anyone who's ever been left behind. If you're listening to this and you've lost someone, not to death, but to distance, know this: you will survive. The pain will soften. The silence will stop echoing. And one day, you'll wake up and realize that their absence no longer defines your story. You do. Revenge, I've learned, doesn't have to hurt. Sometimes, it's just living with dignity when the world expected you to crumble. It's smiling when no one thought you could. It's forgiving, not because they deserve it, but because you do. As I sit here tonight, Watching the sun dip beneath the horizon, I feel the same golden light warm my face that once touched hers. And for a moment, I imagine she's somewhere out there, feeling it too. Maybe she's thinking of me.
Maybe not.
But either way, we're both where we're meant to be. I take a slow breath, exhale, and smile.
40 years of love. 10 years of silence. And now peace.
If there's one thing life has taught me, it's this: sometimes silence is the best revenge, and peace is the loudest victory. So to anyone who's ever been broken, betrayed, or left behind, remember: you don't need to prove your worth to those who walked away. You just need to live so well that your peace becomes your answer. Because in the end, love doesn't always stay, but wisdom always does.
And that, my friend, is enough.